Eso es.
Sí. Nada, oye, muchísimas gracias a todos por venir, por el rollo que os acabo de soltar antes, pero de verdad, por estar con nosotros, por compartir un tiempo con Patrick Svensson. Entiendo que la mayor parte de los que estáis aquí es porque conocéis su anterior libro, El Evangelio de las Anguilas. Os puedo garantizar que este libro es mejor que El Evangelio de las Anguilas, que era un libro excepcional, pero que este os va a gustar más, y os animo a que le escuchéis y también a que hagáis preguntas. Y como os decía antes, pues intentaremos que el evento sea lo más ágil posible. En principio no vamos a traducir las respuestas, pero por favor sí que preguntaremos si al final de la respuesta de Patrick hay algo que no se ha entendido. Paramos un momento, aclaramos lo que no se haya entendido y continuamos. Para presentar el libro está aquí Bruno Pardo con nosotros, que es un periodista paisano mío gallego, de una ciudad muy marítima, Ogrove, en la provincia de Pontevedra, y que nos parecía la persona perfecta para hablar con Patrick del mar y de literatura. Y Macarena, que es nuestra magnífica traductora, que nos va a traducir. Ya os dejo sin más con ellos. Muchas gracias a todos por haber venido, a Patrick y a Bruno y a Macarena por hacer posible.
Bueno, yo voy a empezar presentando a Patrick, para los que no lo conozcáis. Patrick es periodista y escritor. Nació en 1972 en Suecia, en un pueblo pequeño al sur de Grecia, o sea, al sur de Suecia, es decir, al sur del norte. Allí creció rodeado de naturaleza, muy cerca del mar, y creció, digamos, como un niño asilvestrado, tuvo esa suerte. Su padre murió cuando tenía 12 años. No compartía muchas cosas con él, pero sí una muy importante, que era la pesca de anguilas en el río. Muchos años después, en 2019, Patrick publicó El Evangelio de las Anguilas, que se convirtió muy pronto en un bestseller mundial, a fuerza de recordarnos que todavía existen misterios en el mundo, pero que están en lo pequeño. Sabemos que las anguilas se reproducen en el mar de los Sargazos, pero nadie nunca, jamás, ha visto ni capturado una anguila en este mar, que está allí en el Atlántico Norte. En ese libro Patrick mezclaba la teología y la vida propia, y lo mismo hablaba de Aristóteles, que se murió creyendo que las anguilas nacían del fango, como hablaba de su propia infancia. Todo hilaba con una prosa apasionada, que es la prosa de un hombre que cree que la curiosidad es el motor no solo de la ciencia, sino de la vida. Y que vivir es mucho más divertido cuando bajas a la playa y en lugar de ver una concha, ves una historia o una pregunta. Si su primer libro estaba dedicado a su padre, este segundo libro que presentamos hoy está dedicado a su madre. Este libro es una historia de la humanidad, por así decirlo, a través del mar. Sin embargo, a su madre no le gustaba el mar, le tenía miedo a las profundidades. Cuando iban a una piscina, en vez de remojar los pies a la piscina de los mayores, lo hacía la de los pequeños. Y sin embargo, Patrick le ha dedicado este libro. ¿Por qué? Bueno, la madre de Patrick le enseñó a leer, lo llevaba a las bibliotecas y allí descubrió que el mundo era mucho más ancho que el que tenía ante sus ojos. Este libro es un libro lleno de gestas. Está la primera vuelta al mundo, está también la caza de los balleneros en el siglo XVIII, todas esas locuras que hacían buscando cachalotes, pero también épica, porque el mar es un escenario maravilloso. Es un libro de cosas grandes, pero también de cosas muy pequeñas, de pequeñas historias que han cambiado lo que sabemos del mar. Por ejemplo, la de un panadero escocés del siglo XIX, que era adicto a los paseos por el campo y por la costa, y que un día descubrió un fósil que resultó ser la primera penetración sexual de la historia, que fue entre dos pacodermos hace 385 millones de años. Todo es así de fascinante el libro, os lo prometo. Este libro también es una oda a la curiosidad, a todos esos hombres que han dedicado su vida a conocer el mundo, a explorarlo, para entenderlo. Patrick insiste en que la realidad es un misterio que se desvela año a año, generación tras generación, y que la ciencia es una suma de esfuerzos individuales siempre en la misma dirección, que es la del conocimiento, la de curiosidad y la de la luz. Poco antes de morir, su madre le dijo, será divertido leer este libro, y tenía razón. Patrick, bienvenido, enhorabuena por el libro, y me gustaría empezar preguntándote cuáles son tus primeros recuerdos del mar, cómo llegaste al mar.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and now I will try to speak Spanish. No, I won't. No? Yes. Thank you very much for the presentation, and you're asking me about my first memories of the sea. I remember going swimming in the sea when I was a child, and you know, hunting for crabs in the shoreline, and I loved it. But I have to say that my strongest memories of the sea in my childhood was actually from books. I don't know if maybe you talked about my mother a little bit. My mother was a woman who loved books, and she always read the books for me. She took me to the library, and she gave her own love for books and reading to me. And one day she came home from the library with a book about the fishes in the ocean, a big book with pictures and short text about the fishes. And I became completely obsessed with this book. She had to read it for me time after time after time. I could never get enough of this book until my mother said that, please, we have to read another book. I can't read this book about the fishes anymore. Please let me read another book. And I picked up the book myself, and I started to look through the pages, and I realized suddenly I could read. So I learned to read through a book about the ocean, and now I'm here talking about another book about the ocean. It's a very strange journey, I think.
Este libro, antes que nada, es una historia de la humanidad a través del mar y de cómo el mar nos ha determinado como especie. De hecho, dices en el libro que el mar es lo que permite levantar imperios, de Roma al Imperio Español o al Imperio Británico. ¿Cuál es la relación que ha habido a lo largo de la historia entre el poder y el mar?
Yes, that's very true. Especially, I think, in the time when the modern world was created. I'm talking about the 1400s and the 1500s, the era of explorers, when the Europeans went out on the seas and traveled all around the world to explore, but also to conquer and dominate. It was a time when Spain and Portugal were competing against each other to be the strongest seafaring nation, and by that also being the strongest nation overall. And it was I'm very fascinated by that time, and it was a time of imagination and curiosity, but also, of course, a time of a very brutal time, a time of colonialism. And but absolutely, the way to power and to wealth went through the sea or over the sea, and it has been like that for large parts of history, I think.
¿Crees que el ser humano se acercó al mar por curiosidad o porque lo necesitaba para crecer y para expandirse y para ser poderoso?
I think, of course, it must have been a bit of both. A lot of times people went to the sea to explore new places and to take power over them and to dominate them. But I write in the book also about the very first seafarers, even before people were sailing the Mediterranean, the Polynesians, you know. This was the people that came from the southeast part of Asia, and they, for 5,000 years ago, they started to sail out on the Pacific Ocean, and they, in extremely small, simple boats, without any navigational instruments at all, they were able to sail all the way to Hawaii and to Tahiti and all the way to the eastern island and inhabit these places. And one of the things I write about in the book is how did they find their way? How did they navigate without any instrument at all? And that's a fascinating story. They actually learned in some way to navigate by only using their senses, you know. They were listening to the waters, to the currents and to the waves. They were feeling the wind. They were seeing the stars and the moon and the sun. They were watching the birds, how they moved over the sky. And just using their senses in this way, they were able to navigate these completely open waters for thousands of kilometers. And the next question is, why did they do it? Of course, maybe because they were starving or because of conflict, who knows? But I think that there also has to be some kind of curiosity. They were sailing these extremely large waters just to see what was on the other side.
Bruno, perdona. ¿Vamos bien con...? ¿Sí? Sí. Vale, pues seguimos así. Gracias.
Cuentas en el libro también que los primeros navegantes que llegaron a Australia y Nueva Guinea lo hicieron por casualidad, seguramente, que salieron a navegar por la costa, una tormenta los atacó, por así decirlo, y acabaron en nuevas islas que no conocían. ¿Cuánto pesa el azar a lo largo de la historia de la navegación? ¿Cuántas cosas hemos descubierto por azar? ¿Cuántas islas? ¿Cuántos continentes?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, a lot of times it was by chance, and a lot of times these sailors never got anywhere because they drowned or their ships were broken. But we will never know. But what we do know is, for example, that the Polynesians were able to navigate over very large areas of water just using their senses, and that they were very, very competent in this. But of course, you're right, chance was a big part of it too.
Hay una constante en el libro que repites. Hay una constante en el libro que repites y es que la vida viene del mar y el ser humano parece que no deja de volver, como si hubiera una fuerza irresistible que nos arrastre hacia el mar. Y de hecho dices que tal vez lo que nos haga humanos es que el ser humano no se mueve solo por necesidad, sino también porque quiere, y que es más potente muchas veces la curiosidad que el miedo a lo desconocido.
I think curiosity is a big part of the exploration of the world through all of history. But when it comes to the sea, I found when I wrote the book that it seems like it's a special, very strong kind of curiosity that the sea brings out in people. And I think it has something to do with that the sea has always represented the unknown, not because it's so extremely large and it's such a big part of the world, but also because a very big part of the sea was a place where people for almost all our history weren't able to go. I'm talking about the deep sea, of course. For almost all of human history, we weren't able to go down to the deep sea, and we weren't able to observe it, and we had no idea what was down there actually. and that started people's imagination. And there's a lot of mythology concerning the deep sea. But I think that's also what's very often has attracted people, because people are attracted by the mystery, but people are attracted by those things that we cannot understand and can't fully describe and can't fully be a part of, I guess.
El primer descenso que se hizo a la parte más profunda del mar, que está en la fosa de las Marianas, fue en 1960. Tardaron como 4 horas lo cuentas en el libro, tardaron como 4 horas en tocar el fondo. Iban 2 personas en ese batiscafo, subieron vivas, no volvieron nunca jamás a bajar a esas profundidades, y pasaron 50 años hasta que otro ser humano se atrevió a ir ahí. En esos 50 años el hombre llegó a la luna, fue varias veces a la luna, volvió vivo, pero nadie volvió a bajar a la fosa de las Marianas. ¿Por qué crees que no hemos vuelto a bajar? O sea, ¿por qué durante tanto tiempo no se volvió a bajar a la fosa de las Marianas?
Why didn't they go back to the Challenger Deep? The Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean is the biggest depth of the oceans. It's 11,000 meters down. It's a place that's very strange and, of course, extremely dangerous. This is one of my favorite stories in the book about the 2 people who were the first to dive down to the deepest point in the ocean. It was in 1960 in January, and it was 2 men. They were called Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, and they had a very strange kind of ship that they were going to dive with. And they had almost no idea what they were going to find down there. It was a place that was so strange to every human, but they had decided to at least try. They knew it was a very dangerous place, and they knew that they may never come back, but they wanted to try anyway. And that's a travel that's like a horror movie. They started to descend down into the Marianas, and you have to understand, after only a couple of minutes, at 300 meters, it's completely dark. There's no light at all. It's like a night down there. And so they continued to dive through this night, through this complete darkness, for 5 hours. That's how long it took to reach the bottom of it. After about 4.5 hours, 10,000 meters down, suddenly in this complete darkness, the whole ship was shaking like they had hit something. And they said, what could that be? Maybe that's some kind of sea monster or something. but they continued to sink anyway. And after 5 hours, they landed on the bottom, and they turned a small lamp on, and they looked out on this very strange landscape. And the first thing they saw was a little fish swimming by the window. And then suddenly Don Walsh said that, oh, now I know what we hit just before. And they saw there was a big crack through the window, the glass window. And they get panicked, of course, and they started to go up to the surface again as fast as they could. And but it was not very fast. It took 4.5 hours. But they made it, and they got up to the surface again, alive. But I think that explains why they didn't go back there again, and maybe that also explains why it took 50 years for the next person to go down there. since 1960, only 4 people have gone down to the Challenger Deep, and this is the same time as 12 people have walked on the moon. About 10,000 people have climbed the Mount Everest, but only 4 people have gone down to the biggest depth of the ocean.
¿Crees que es tan desconocido el fondo del mar, o el fondo por lo menos de la fosa de las Marianas, como lo es la superficie de Marte?
Yeah, I write this in the book because people have said this before. It's not me. That maybe we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the deep sea, and maybe it's actually true. I quote some scientists in the book that say that we still today about 70 to 80% of the deep sea all over the world is completely unexplored. No people have been there. We haven't observed it. We still know very little what actually is down there.
Hay un momento muy bonito en el libro en el que describes cómo se empieza a medir la profundidad, porque parece evidente, pero una cosa es navegar el mar y otra cosa es saber qué hay debajo, por dónde navegas. Y consistía en que un montón de gente en un montón de puntos del mundo en su barco tiraba una cuerda para medir hasta dónde llegaba en el fondo, y que fue ese compartir el conocimiento lo que nos empezó a dar datos de cómo eran los océanos por debajo. No, que describa un poco cómo ha sido todo ese proceso de conocer.
Yeah, that was one of the other questions. Well, often when I
Verde.
No?
Yeah.
Sorry. Often when I write, I start with very simple questions, and one of those questions is, how do we really know how deep the ocean is? I mean, before the modern instruments, how do they know? And the technique that people have used for thousands of years is, in English it's called sounding. It's when you take a weight of metal, pull it on a string, and you just let it go down to the bottom, and then you drag it up, and you can measure the string and see how deep it was. And people have done this for thousands of years. It's mentioned in the Bible that they use this method. And at the beginning, of course, it was a way of navigating to know when the depth was getting lesser, so you wouldn't hit anything. But after some time, people started doing this on great depths when it was very deep waters, and they did this. I guess as out of curiosity. There wasn't really any technical point to doing this. It was just because they wanted to know, I guess. They used to put some stuff on the weight that when it landed on the bottom, you got some organisms or different stuff from the bottom up to the surface, and you can see, oh, there's a small snail there down there or something. And a very interesting part of this too is that it was like a worldwide community. When you look at all the maps of the sea from the 1500s or 1600s, there's a lot of different dots with the depth marked. And all this was, of course, collected from thousands of people who have been doing this for hundreds of years, and collecting their knowledge to some kind of collective bank of knowledge. And that's also, I think, a beautiful example of how human knowledge has developed over history.
Hay dos figuras en el libro que son fundamentales. Vamos a empezar por la primera, que es Robert Dick, que es este panadero escocés que descubrió la primera penetración sexual de la historia. Le dedicas prácticamente el capítulo más largo a él. ¿Por qué? ¿Cómo descubriste este personaje? ¿Y qué es lo que te interesa de él?
Yeah, well, I guess the book is basically about people who have, in different ways, tried to explore the ocean and the world around us. And I guess the most unknown of these persons is the man called Robert Dick, that I found by accident a couple of years ago. I was reading a newspaper in an English newspaper. It's a very short article, but the headline was that sex emerged in Scotland. I mean, sex was invented in Scotland. And I had no idea about this, but I had to read it. And so the story was that there was a fossil of a very old primitive fish that they have studied now, and the fossil was found in the 1800s, but they have studied it again, and they found out that it was sensational, because this old fish that lived for like 300 million years ago was the first organism in evolution that actually, to describe it simple, that had a penis. And this was a sensation. And at the end of the article it said that we know this because of this fossil that was found in the 1800s by a man called Robert Dick, which was... I got curious, who was this Robert Dick? And it turns out he was a Scottish baker, actually. He was a baker, and he was very poor, he was very lonely, he never married, he had no kids. He lived in the Scottish Highlands, northern part of Scotland. He never had any education, he never went to the university, but he had a passion for exploring the nature around him all by himself, with no education. And he became, completely on his own, one of the biggest experts of the nature around him, of all the plants, all the animals, the insects, the ocean out there, and also an expert of fossils, because he collected fossils. And he, just by chance, he happened to find this fossil of this fish that 150 years later turned out to be a fish, the organism that was the first to have a penis. And so after his death he was... they actually named this fish after him, so it's called the Microbrachus dicki.
Hay una cosa muy bonita de Robert Dick, y es que él compartía sus descubrimientos con un periodista o con un investigador científico, y él una vez lo mencionó en un artículo y le escribió una carta y le dijo no me menciones, como lo hacía todo por amor al conocimiento. Es como esa clase de conocimiento, de amor por el saber gratuito completamente, que ha hecho avanzar mucho la ciencia también, ¿no?
I think I found in Robert Dick, I found an example of this kind of curiosity that was completely clean or pure. You know, he didn't try to gain anything. He didn't try to make money out of his knowledge. He didn't try to be famous or anything. It really seems that he was just curious, and he had a love of knowledge in itself.
La otra figura que quería recordar es la de Rachel Carson, que también es de agradecerte que hayas rescatado tanto en este libro como en el anterior, que también lo mencionas, en el Evangelio de las Anguilas, que es la gran biógrafa del mar, y tampoco tuvo una vida muy fácil, y también para ella fue un esfuerzo continuo luchar contra su vida para brindarnos uno de los mejores libros de de la historia del mar. ¿Cómo llegaste a ella y por qué? Y a ella sí que le dedicas el segundo capítulo más largo del libro, es el de Robert Dick, pero el más largo es el de Rachel Carson. ¿Por qué? Y ¿por qué cierras el libro con ella? ¿Cuál es la importancia de esta mujer en la historia del mar?
Why does the book end with Rachel Carson? It's chronological, you know. No, but also in some way she's the main character of the book. Rachel Carson was an American writer and marine biologist, one of the most important ones during the 1900s. Many people know her from the book Silent Spring. It was her last book. It was one of the books that started the environmental movement. But she actually spent all her life trying to understand the ocean. She wrote 3 books about the sea, and she was most of all an expert on the sea. And she had a remarkable life, coming from very poor circumstances, trying to make an academic career, but had to abandon it because her family was too poor, but still managed to do everything she did. And for me, she's also an inspiration because of she had an ability to write about extremely scientific things with an extremely scientific approach to it, but also with an extremely beautiful language, almost poetic. She managed to combine the science with poetry in a way that very few people have done, I think, and that's one of the things that really inspires me.
Citas una conferencia de ella en la que dice que si el ser humano dedicara más tiempo a asombrarse ante el universo, tal vez tendría menos ganas de destruirlo. No sé si crees que tenía razón y si crees que el conocimiento nos puede cambiar las acciones del ser humano.
Yes, I think there's some truth to it. That it's not only knowledge that is important. Rachel Carson actually talked a lot about what she called the sense of wonder. She said it's very important that we can feel a sense of wonder about the world and about the nature around us. She said we shouldn't be afraid to look at nature with the child of an eye. You know, when a child sees nature, the first expression is wonder. And she said that this sense of wonder is important because in the wonder is the seed for both for knowledge but also for empathy. And knowledge and empathy are two things that maybe more often should go together.
Das un par de datos bastante tristes en el libro. La segunda vez que alguien bajó al abismo de Challenger, en vez de ver un pececito, como vieron los primeros, vieron una bolsa de plástico. Y otro dato, bastante más triste todavía, es que en los años 60, en Terranova, en la costa de Canadá, se pescaban 800.000 toneladas de bacalao al año y 20 años después solo sacaban 2.000, porque lo estamos agotando. ¿Crees que vamos nosotros a vivir el fin del mar tal y como lo conocemos?
The sea is going to be around, you know. It's not going to disappear, but I'm afraid of how it will change, you know. Because one thing that the sea is so enormous and so powerful, but we have to remember that it's also very vulnerable. You know, very small changes in the sea have very dramatic consequences. If, for example, if we talk about climate change, if the temperature in the sea rises just a little bit, just 1 degree, it has enormous consequences. It's affecting, for example, the big ocean currents, for example, the Gulf Stream. And that has extreme consequences not only for the sea and for all the life in the sea, but also for the whole world, because it changes like climate in itself, and that's very scary, I think.
Hay una cosa que he pensado leyendo el libro, y es que hasta hace un siglo había gente que podía vivir y morir sin ver el mar. Hoy, a día de hoy, eso ya no ocurre, casi todo el mundo ha visto el mar o lo va a ver. Y sin embargo, no sabemos casi nada del mar. No tenemos ni idea de cómo funcionan las corrientes, ni de cuán profundo es, ni cómo sufre con nuestra acción. ¿Crees que adolecemos de un gran desconocimiento del mar?
Well, many people know a lot of things about the sea, but I guess a lack of knowledge is always a problem. As I was talking about, the vulnerability of the sea is maybe something that through history there has been this idea that the sea is an unlimited resource. It was there in the 17 and 1800s when they were hunting for whales all over the world. There was this idea that it doesn't matter how many whales we catch and kill, there will always be plenty of them. It was the same in the 1900s when the modern industrial fishing was developed, that it doesn't matter how many fish we catch, or it doesn't matter which methods we use, the sea is unlimited. And it's actually just in the last decades that we really have started to understand that of course is not true.
De hecho, la evolución del conocimiento del mar que cuentas en el libro está muy ligada a la economía. O sea, en el siglo XVI se da la vuelta al mundo, no solo por curiosidad, sino para buscar una nueva ruta para las especias. Luego los balleneros conquistan mares que estaban sin conquistar para cazar cachalotes y así conseguir el aceite para iluminar ciudades como París o Londres. Parece que siempre hemos buscado en el mar algo que explotar, y que tiene sentido que no dejemos de explotarlo porque es por lo que fuimos por primera vez, a lo mejor.
There should be something that the human being wants to explore, right? Like, can this continue like that?
Yeah, well, it seems to be it continues in that way that there's like something in human history that when we discover something, then we explore it, and then we conquer it, and then we destroy it. You know, that's the way things often have been. But when it comes to the sea, it's almost like it's backwards there. We're starting to destroy it and conquer it before we really explore it, and we are destroying things that we still really don't know is there. And that for example, right now there's a lot of exploration being done about trying to find minerals at the sea bottom, and minerals or oil at the bottom of the deep sea. And that's, of course, one example of this kind of very dangerous science that is the object for the science is to gain something from it.
Hay una pregunta personal que tengo que hacerte, y es que has escrito sobre piratas, balleneros, aventureros, pero tú nunca has estado en alta mar. ¿Por qué no has estado en alta mar?
You write about pirates, adventurers, but you've never been in the deep sea, so
Are you saying I'm a coward? No, but I have to admit that I have mostly explored the ocean through books, you know. But maybe I am a little bit afraid. I have big respect for the sea, you know, for the power and for the depth, and you know, you can get this feeling even if you're just out swimming, and when you see it's getting dark under you and you feel the depth beneath you, then you have to feel respect for the sea.
Rachel Carson decía que cuando veía el mar y escuchaba el movimiento repetitivo de las olas y esa música que ella describía como si fuera el estribillo de la naturaleza, decía que había como algo sanador en eso. ¿Qué sientes tú cuando te pones enfrente del mar y lo observas durante mucho tiempo?
Rachel Carson tells us how she listened to the rhythm of the waves and the depth, like of meditation of her life. So what do you feel when you're close to the ocean?
Yeah, there's also the ocean is not only scary. It can also be very soothing and almost like a meditation. I love the sound of the ocean, and I love being close to it. Just not maybe. I wouldn't go down to the Challenger Deep. I can say that.
Me gustaría hacerte una pregunta sobre el Evangelio de las Anguilas también. Ha sido un éxito mundial y es un libro que cuenta simplemente, es una gran historia, pero es la historia de las anguilas. Pasado el tiempo, ¿cómo te explicas el éxito del libro? ¿Qué crees que es lo que conectó con tanta gente?
So changing now and talking about your other books, about the Beatles, it was a great success all over the world, and now that something has passed, how do you, now that you're that young and think about it, why do you think this happened? How do you explain to yourself this great success of the book all over the world?
Well, I don't know if I can explain it, but it was my first book. I was quite a late debutant. I wrote my first book, and I decided to write my first book about eels. That may be a strange decision. I wrote it completely by myself and also in secret, because I didn't have any contract with any publisher. I didn't have any contact at all with publisher, and I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, because for myself it seemed such a strange idea. I remember when I was almost finished and I was thinking about maybe sending it to a publisher, and a friend of mine asked me, well, come on, tell me now, what are you writing about? And I said, okay, I write a book about eels. And he just patted me on the shoulder and said, poor you. So I was, of course, extremely surprised by everything, and but I guess what I took away from it was that you should always follow your own curiosity and your own passion and your own interest. If you really are passionate and interested in something, just do it.
Una periodista, que no recuerdo su nombre, lamentablemente ahora mismo, dijo que era un libro peligroso porque si lo leías luego te podías encontrar a las 3 de la mañana dándole la chapa a un amigo sobre las 4 metamorfosis de la anguila o sobre dónde pescar las mejores angulas. No sé si tú has hablado mucho de las anguilas con tus amigos o no.
A journalist, he doesn't remember who, said that it was a very dangerous book because you could end up talking with a friend at night and just telling him about the life of the eel and the transformation and the different steps, and you could go on for a long time. So, have you talked about this with your friends also at some point?
About eels?
Yes.
Oh my God, my poor family. But that was one of the nicest things. I met a lot of people who told me that I could never believe that I would be interested in eels, but now it's all I think about. You know?
Like the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
Lo que quería decir es que el libro lo que viene a demostrar es que cuando miras algo muy de cerca, de repente todas las certezas que tenías se desvanecen y vuelve a ser un misterio, vuelve a ser interesante. Y creo que tanto en ese libro de las anguilas como en este es una constante que se repite.
He's saying that it's really interesting with this book and also with the one with both of them. When you get to be closer to the subject and you get to know so much, there's a moment when you're learning a lot, but the next step is when it's again a mystery. So you go like.
Yeah. Yes, but I'm like to think of myself like I have a scientific approach to the world, and I believe in the scientific methods, and I trust them. But I'm very attracted to I'm not only interested in the things we know about the world, but I'm also very interested in the things we still don't know. And the eel is a perfect example, because people for hundreds of years have tried to understand the eel, but there's still so many questions. We think we know that all eels are born in the Sargasso Sea, but no one has still today seen an eel in the Sargasso Sea. So they have made all these different types of scientific research to try to find an eel in the Sargasso Sea, but still haven't made it. And that's you just have to. Maybe it's in some way you have to admire the eel for keeping its secrets for so long.
Bueno, ahora tenéis la oportunidad de preguntarle lo que queráis a Patrick, cosas de las anguilas o de otras especies también. No hay limitaciones.
Patrick, yo quería preguntarte...
El micro, pásale, Bruno, el micro.
Quería preguntarte una cosa. Suecia tú eres sueco y Suecia es una nación muy marinera y no aparece Suecia en el libro. Y quería preguntarte si es algo premeditado o por qué decidiste dejar Suecia fuera.
Yeah, I don't write about the Vikings. That's true. But maybe there's Vikings everywhere. You know, I didn't have to write about them too. But also, I think it's when you talk about the early navigators, there's not very much documentation about the Vikings, and there's much more documentation about the Greeks and Spain and Italy and. So that's one of the reasons, and also I'm basically a little bit tired of Vikings. Okay, next book then.
¿Alguna otra pregunta por ahí? Si no, sigo preguntando yo hasta que nos aburramos, pero... ¿Ninguna? Vale, bueno, pues yo tengo otra pregunta y es... me ha sorprendido mucho el detalle tan pequeño que sabemos de cosas, por ejemplo, como la vuelta al mundo, que tenemos el diario de a bordo, o absolutamente todos los detalles de cómo el ser humano bajó a la fosa del Challenger, cómo ha sido la documentación del libro y cómo has encontrado esas fuentes tan directas.
Well, for me, the writing is always in combination with reading. It has always been like that. I read a lot, and I read a lot without really knowing what I'm looking for, and that's a way of doing research that I really enjoy, because you find things that you didn't know you were looking for. And when you find something, it often leads to something else, and it's like being in just jumping into the stream and let's ride along, you know.
Perdón, yo tengo otra, que es que al final tratas de 8 cosas muy concretas en el libro. ¿Hay algún otro tema que hubiera sido importante que por distintas razones dejaras fuera del libro y que ahora te puedas arrepentir de haber dejado fuera del nuevo libro?
Además de los vikingos, claro.
Yeah, now I think it's the Vikings. No, there's a lot of things you left out, of course. I would like to. This is basically a collection of essays, separated text. But I would. My idea was that they were in some way to be connected with each other, and this connection is, for me, basically, it's a book about human curiosity and how this curiosity has been especially strong in connection with the sea. So, but there's a lot of story. It's not a complete history of humans and the sea, but it's so of course there's a lot of history and a lot of stories that are left out.
Nos estás diciendo que ya estás haciendo otro libro sobre el mar también, que lo tendremos en un par de años.
I'm already working on the next book about the sea with the following stories like
Yeah, this is sequel. No, not really, no.
Aquí.
You talked about how Rachel Carson created a really poetic book, but also really scientific. But I'm really interested in how you approach your literary process, because you're not just writing about scientific data, but you're also using really beautiful words and a really beautiful way of telling it. So why did you choose to do it that way?
Well, yeah, I always... my ambition is that it's not only going to be facts and knowledge. It's also I also want it to be an experience to read it, and it's very important for me that the language and the way you tell the story. And for me, one way to make it a better story is trying to find, especially if you write about science or natural science, it's not only important to ask the question what do we know about the eel, for example. I also like to ask the question, how do we know the things we know? And that's when you find the characters and the stories and the people that makes it alive and interesting. That's when you find like Sigmund Freud and or Robert Dick or all those characters. Yeah.
¿Tenemos alguna otra pregunta por ahí? Si no, bueno,
Sí,
hago yo la última.
Sí, la última y luego lo dejamos y podéis charlar con un rato con Patrick, con el libro.
Yo quería preguntarte de de las 8 partes que tiene el libro y de las gestas que cuentas, ¿cuál ha sido la más determinante en la historia del mar?
All the deeds that you great adventures and deeds that you explain in the book, ¿cuál es, perdón, alguno
La más determinante.
the one that you think is more important than principle for the sea?
Yeah, it's difficult. We haven't talked about Magallanes, but there's an essay about him in the first circumnavigation of the world, and that's an example of this very important time that I was talking about, the era of the explorer, that I find very fascinating and has been extremely important for how the world looks today. So that's one of those stories that I think was important for the book.
Maybe you can add a little bit on that.
You want me to talk more about Magallanes?
Why is the story so relevant to you?
Not only for me, but for how the world looks. Yeah, yes. If I start talking about Magallanes, we may be stuck here. No, just one short example. When Magallanes and his 5 ships went out from Sevilla in 1519, there were 5 ships and I think about 280 people on the ships. You probably all know this because you're from Spain, but one of the ships came back 3 years later, and there were 18 people left on of the expedition. So it's an extremely, it's such an adventure. But one of the things one small thing that I find very interesting is how, when the Europeans during this time were traveling the world and taking power of the world, dominating it, one thing they did it with was by naming it, by language. When they came to South America, they were sailing down the coast and they saw a hill and they said, we call it Montevideo. Then they came to this strait, this passage through the southern part of Argentina, that's now called Magellan Strait, and they were sailing there and they didn't see any people at all, but at night they saw on land there were fires. So they said, this is Tierra del Fuego. Yes. And when they came to the other side, the Pacific Ocean is there. It's the first time a European sees the Pacific Ocean. This completely unknown sea for them. And just this morning, it happened to be very, very calm. And the Pacific Ocean is almost never calm. But this morning it was. So Magallanes is looking out over this enormous body of water and he says, this is the Mar de Pacifico. And those names are still around today, and that's a way of taking control over the world by naming it. That's very interesting.
Otra de las islas del Pacífico sufrieron un robo y se llamó la Isla de los Ladrones y se ha quedado así para la posteridad también.
Yeah, the stand about the island of the burglars that we talked about.
Exactly. Yes. They were going to sail over the Pacific Ocean. Magallanes said it's going to take about a week. It took 3 months, and they had no food, and a lot of people died. But suddenly, at last, they came to an island. It's the island that's now called Guam. And they met people there. The people came out, everyone was happy, but then the people, they stole a small boat that was connected to Magallanes' ship, and he was very mad, and he sent his soldier ashore and said, kill them all, burn the village. And then he said, let's call this island the Ladronas, I think it's in Spanish, the Ladronas. And that name was actually the name of the islands for a very, very long time.
Patrick, muchísimas gracias por tu tiempo y tus palabras. Espero que os haya
Muchísimas
gustado.
gracias.